Hello. All the headlines, a lot of the headlines we're seeing lately are disturbing. And I've got a playlist called Growing Up in the 1950s. And if you didn't grow up during that time, trust me, it was a whole different world, a lot more simple. Um, it wasn't a fast world like we have today. So, what happened? So this is my second attempt at this video. On my first take, I rambled on for about 20 minutes thinking of one thing after another that moved us to where we are today. So I've had a little bit of time to think about that, and I'll try to limit it to four things. But I'll preface it by telling you what my mom always told me, and it was something to live by. She said, "You may not be handsome, you may not be rich, but you can always be kind." And that's the way she lived her life, and my father did too. So, uh, all right, here again, another preface to my 4 points. When I was in the seventh grade, I was a member of the 4-H club rifle team. And we would bring our rifles to school on the school bus, check them in at the principal's office. And then after school, we'd go get our rifles and go out on the playground. The sponsor of the club would set up the targets and we'd shoot our rifles. If anybody had said there's been a drive-by shooting, I wouldn't even have known what I would have been. I mean, I wouldn't know what that even meant. The thought that anybody would point a weapon at somebody else and pull the trigger was just not my upbringing. My dad bought me a single shot 22 bolt action rifle when I was 10 years old. And he supervised me carefully. Now, by that time, I had demonstrated that I would obey my parents and was guilty of nothing more than just minor youthful indiscretions. Had I been troublesome, there's no way my father would ever given me a rifle or access to one. And I can say that with a certainty. He was veteran of World War II. He joined the Navy in the summer of 1941. And by December, when Pearl Harbor happened, he was in for the duration of the war. So he served nearly 7 years altogether. Only lacked one theater ribbon from every theater of World War II. And his last assignment, he was a photographer's mate, was to work on the Bikini bomb test, atomic bomb. That was conducted by the Navy, and it consisted of 2 explosions, one atmospheric and one underwater. But they sent the photographers, because they'd set up all the equipment, loaded it, and set it up ready for the test. So in 2 hours after the blast to collect the film before the radiation could fog the film. And they were dressed in dungarees and t-shirts. So anybody who went through World War II and survived it, particularly if they saw action, that instilled, I believe, a sense of value of life over and above what the general population had, because they'd seen enough killing and in some cases done enough killing to not want to do that anymore. If you ever get a chance to see the series Band of Brothers, which is basically a docudrama based on the siege at Bastogne, and the role the 101st Airborne played in that. The reason it's so outstanding is it interviews the surviving members of that action, including the central character. I'm getting too much into this, but it shows you why World War II, that horrible thing that cost about 20 million lives or more, the positive impact it had on our society. For the most part, the veterans from that weren't coming back looking for trouble. They'd seen plenty of trouble. Okay, the 4 points that changed society, in my opinion. Everything I'm saying is my opinion. The first thing is the Vietnam War. It was so controversial, and it lacked so much justification. Now, let me hasten to add that I believe the only righteous, if you will, wars we had ended with the World War II. Everything else we've done for philosophical and political reasons, sometimes economic, not like all. And we're paying a price for that, not only in terms of treasure and blood, but also in the spiritual, ethical nature of our society. And that's bled over to a lot of things. There's a theory called the broken window theory. If you have an abandoned house, it stays in pretty good shape until the first person throws a rock through the window. And that just opens the whole thing up. Pretty soon it's got no windows left and it's looted. So having some moral adjudication of justice in a timely and certain fashion, I think is an integral part of society. Having worked in a country for a couple of years where everything was a payoff, there's corruption on every level, and the fact that just robbed the general population of any hope of getting better. So that was part of it. The second thing, I think, has to do with the prohibition of corporal punishment for raising our kids. My mom and dad, when absolutely necessary, would use a switch or a belt, never a hand, to administer punishment. And looking back on that as an adult, that was the greatest punishment I could have gotten. Nowadays, they fuss at, the parents fuss at their kids. Oh, you know better than that, you know, and at that stage of development, the kid, that just goes right over their head. But I guarantee you, a little switch and bare legs, they'll remember that. I know I do. And I can say with absolute belief that I deserved every spanking I got. And I was better off for it, because kids are going to try to test the boundaries. So if your boundaries are off the chart, then their actions trying to test for that battery are finally going to cross the legal barriers, and they're going to end up in serious trouble from which there's little recovery. Whereas with my parents, they kept the boundary low. It was their way or the highway. I mean, it was basically, and yet it was administered with complete love. I never doubted that. All right, number 3, which is another one having to do with raising kids. In the 50s, it was rare for a wife to have to work. What people were satisfied with in terms of standard of living was reasonable and something that could be provided for by one worker in the family. So that left the mother there to watch over the kids, train them in the ways they should go. And now we've gotten to the point where sometimes 2 paychecks aren't enough to support the standard of living that everybody's seeking, or that couple is seeking. So the kid gets taken care of by third parties, and so they don't have that really strong parental guidance that I was blessed with, and that I was able to administer to my kids. I raised 3 kids, two boys and a girl, and all I'm gonna tell you that when they got a spanking, they deserved it and they were glad for it. Anyway, I don't digress too much into that, but the third thing, it's going to surprise a lot of people and offend a lot of people, and that is the effect of the Miranda ruling had on law enforcement. I worked for Atlanta Police Department in 1972, and we have an interview that goes, first thing I want to tell you is you don't have to tell me anything. You can have a lawyer, we'll provide it. Anything you do say will be held against you. So what kind of interview are you going to have with that person? None. Not of any consequence. You say, well, that's when you go out and gather police work instead of looking for a confession. Well, that's true. But sometimes somebody bringing an arrest may be the means of finding the person that really did it. So if they are not allowed to speak, or their court-appointed attorney pressures them to accept a plea deal, then the real criminal never gets convicted, never gets caught. Were there abuses before that? I'm sure there were. But what I saw in terms of the difficulty and the frustration of detectives in particular, trying to get a crime solved is just horrendous. And the burnout rate was terrible, which could end up one of 2 ways. The police officer could get violent with his suspects and be off the force and maybe in jail, or he'd just get burned out and didn't care. So as soon as the suspect would say, I want a lawyer, then he was done. No further effort. So he'd work out his 20 and put in his papers and try to forget about it all. Okay, the fourth thing is our immigration policies. The 2 years I spent working in Mexico was during Jimmy Carter's presidency. And they had what was called a guest worker program, which was run by the government and the embassies in Mexico. So somebody who wanted to work in the U.S. would apply in Mexico. They'd run a very brief background check, and then they would issue him a card, and he'd go to the American side, and they would sign him if he hadn't done that program. It was a 6-month program. If he hadn't done that program before, they would assign him a special Social Security number. And and he was, I think, technically required to file a tax return, but none of them would have made enough money to make that necessary. But then the farmers or whoever hired them were required by law, how much they complied, I don't know, to report the income through any of us who work in the U.S. would have to do. You got FICA, you got income tax and whatnot. So before I left Mexico, Jimmy Carter left office, and the guest worker program was not continued. That was a sudden. The 6-month visas that were in effect were allowed to continue until they ran out, but no more were ever issued. Now, the impact in the U.S. was the fact that all the farmers along the Rio Grande, and I know of one particular one who had 10 sections, 10 square miles of land he was cultivating in white onions. So the season when there was no more worker permits being issued, he couldn't get enough workers. Because, see, during the program, he was expanding what he had under cultivation because he had somebody to harvest and to pack and clean. So now most of his 10 sections was cultivated. And he had nobody to harvest. So he plowed 10 square miles of white onions under because there's nobody to harvest them. And you might say, well, why don't you just hire local workers? They're not going to work out in West Texas sun handling onions. It's not going to do it. Whereas the worker that was coming up from Mexico, he was at that time was making about $1.80 a day. And their wages proportional to what we have here are still miles apart, which is the reason that we can build a wall 1,000 feet high, 1,000 feet deep, 5,000 miles long, and they're still going to come. Because the people who are coming have no hope where they're at. And the point is, we need the workers. So what we've got now is it becomes a political football. It's not administered well at all. It's always a panic or an outlet for political games and personal horrors. So that's the other thing. Our population is, in terms of if you exclude immigrants, is actually decreasing. So, and I'm part of the baby boomers. So when all of us die off, that's going to be a huge hit to the population. And we're already, most of us are retired, so we're not capable or willing to work. So who's going to jump in there? The fifth thing, which is coming, it's not quite here yet, although we're seeing a lot of things happen with automation. my working career, I was a computer programmer, wrote software. And the software I wrote put hundreds of people out of work. The political message was, we'll just retrain them into something pays better. At any rate, you know how that turned out. So now we're into AI. And as a programmer, I can appreciate the work and the genius that went into developing that and continues to develop it. The problem is, that can be summed up. If you've ever been into a retail store and paid with cash and the cashier didn't know how to count the change back, if we let AI do all of our thinking for us, we're soon not going to think at all. So I don't know. I guess we all go to Margaritaville. But anyway, those are the 5 things that I think changed our society. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of comments, and I welcome that. And people commenting, please read all the other comments and respond to other people's comments. In other words, that's an opportunity for a real debate on all these points I've made, plus some. And I certainly invite you to do that. And if I see a trend that I might be able to expedite by creating another video on that particular point, I'll certainly do that. So, to that end, if you'll please subscribe, if you like the video, hit like. And because I'm pretty prolific in publishing videos. I think about 6 active playlists now. One on hobbies, another one on selling stock options, another on welding, machining, and what it was like living in the 1950s. So if you go to my channel, you'll see lots of videos to watch. Some of them you may find beneficial. I hope so. Thank you for watching.